Hi, we're back, and we're going to start a little segment here on what I think is a kind of an interesting subject, and land values that are lost to the community and have become lost to the community over the past century or so. And that loss causes corrosion of the tax base because we're replacing community-created land values with taxes on privately created value. Now, a great example of this is one of the poorest cities in the United States, Philadelphia. Of the 10 largest cities in the United States, is by far the poorest. Our 40% of our population is below the poverty line, and yet it's halfway between Washington and New York on the East Coast, in between great transit and port facilities. So again, why is it so poor? Well, this is how the current tax system plays out, and it plays out like this in many places. I use Philadelphia because I'm working on the place. Up top, we're going to look at a family of four making $50,000 a year. That's not much money, even in Philadelphia. Under the current tax system, which is very predictable and has been set in place since 1938, they pay $1,550 a year in income taxes, $5,900 a year in property taxes, $1,000 a year in sales taxes. And here's another tax that I add, but it's the auto insurance, which is essentially a tax. And in cities, it's higher. And auto insurance is redlined. In low-income neighborhoods, you pay higher insurance than you do on Park Avenue. It's on purpose. So total tax bill for a family of four making $50,000 is $8,780 a year.
Is that the local tax bill or the entire?
This is the city, yeah.
Just the city.
Yeah, imagine, we're not even counting what they would pay in federal or state. And Pennsylvania has a flat tax as well as the city of Philadelphia. It's horribly regressive. The total burden for a family living in Philadelphia is 17.5%, and that's an annual tax. Now, if we go to a flat surface parking lot, just like the one I described earlier, you folks may not know Philadelphia well, but 15759 North 15th Street is Center City. It's downtown. It's where the action is in Philadelphia. There's a parking lot, and its assessed value is $650,000 a year, and it makes tens of thousands of dollars a month in pure profit. And yet their property tax is just about the same as the family of four making $50,000, $8,683. Their tax burden in the city of Philadelphia is 1.34%, because that's the property tax rate. So if you look at the unfairness of the system by going from publicly created land to privately created value, even for people that don't have much value, it's bad. Now, we had a visitor from Connecticut, and I want to show a case study that a lot of people were talking about. That's Copper Beech Farm in Greenwich, Connecticut. It's 50 acres. It was listed for some time last year as the most expensive house in the United States, house and property, $140 million, right outside of New York City. And you've got to admit, that's pretty nice. I wouldn't mind living there. I like the pool, I like the house, I like the view. It's gorgeous. But the problem with Copper Beech Farm, 50 acres, is that it's listed for $140 million, but its assessed value is $21 million, because they have been able to game the system and get an agricultural exemption. In other words, they're pretending they're farmers. And as you can see, that's not a farm. But what they did was they got it assessed as forest land, as the highest and best use. of the land. In other words, if you wanted to open your own lumber company, you would, of course, go to Greenwich and of course, make your money as a lumberjack. But in point of fact, the highest and best use is what they're going to use it for, which is to split this 50-acre estate into 1-acre lots to create McMansions. Greenwich, like the rest of the United States, is not as wealthy as it used to be. So the big estates are getting broken up. So for over 30 years, the state of Connecticut and the community of Greenwich has lost tens of millions of dollars of what could be collectible land value because the law was changed to suit the landowner. Statutes were gamed to suit the landowner. And that happens all over the city. Here in New York, in Philadelphia, you keep your land zoned industrial until you want it to become condos, and then it gets rezoned, and what has been a free ride then finally becomes your jackpot. And another disappearance of publicly created land value is a rather famous one, and it's the Big Dig in Boston. And I don't know if you're familiar with it, but the Big Dig was a reaction to the highway destruction of cities and urban renewal in the late 50s and early 60s. They had an elevated highway going through Boston, downtown Boston, and it blocked out the light. It was pretty bad. It was like in the old days in New York when you had the L, and if you lived near the L, life was a constant hell. That rhymes. So they came up with the smart idea of burying the elevated highway underground, which they did. And who paid for it? Yeah, us too, even in New York. Yeah, a lot of federal grants, a lot of federal funding, and of course the Massachusetts taxpayers. Now it came in, several $1 billion over budget, but what's a few $1 billion amongst friends? But as the Boston Globe reported, when it opened, commercial properties, and there were almost no working properties at that time. This was an abandoned part of Boston, right on the waterfront. The commercial properties along the Old Artery, which is what they called it, increased in value by 79% in 15 years. And that doubled the citywide land value increase of 41%. Now, if you look at this bird's eye view, you see what happened. That park was created by taxpayer funds, and that's where the highway used to be. Surrounding that park, you see almost all new buildings that were just put up. So somebody that owned that land when it was an elevated highway, once they knew it was going to be buried, they just waited and waited. They let the buildings fall apart. And some people came along later, fixed up the buildings, tore down the unfixable buildings, and this is what we have. How do we get back that public value that we've created with our tax dollars? That's the idea behind land value tax. How can we demonstrate the power of bad taxes? In a lot of ways. Now, this is the state of Maryland, and the main source of revenue for localities in Maryland are counties. And if you look at bad taxes coupled with poverty, coupled with tax exempt eds and meds, hospitals and universities. Baltimore has Johns Hopkins, Baltimore has the University of Maryland, it has a lot of exempt property. If you look at Maryland, which is just about one of the richest states in the country now, you look at the property tax rates for each county. And the red is, of course, the city of Baltimore, the city that happens to be in most need and most at risk from urban problems. And yet the property tax, just the property tax rate for the city of Baltimore is much higher, about double or triple or even quadruple the rest of the counties in Maryland, where people of wealth and means live. how can Baltimore compete? How can they attract development into Baltimore? The only way is subsidies, rent seeking. You know, the Inner Harbor in Baltimore was paid for, one, by the taxpayers, and two, by tax abatements. And the Inner Harbor is where all the tourists go and buy, you know, crab cakes and all of that stuff. But the rest of Baltimore has essentially been abandoned, and it's still like that. And if we've been following the news, we know that the people in Baltimore are angry and have every right to be angry. Until we fix their tax system, and we've done studies for Baltimore, and luckily in 2016 the legislature has entertained a law that would permit Baltimore to do a land value tax. But unless we fix that, or somebody fixes it, Baltimore is never going to get the capital and the people it needs to revive that city. Again, the people that are stuck and left behind are a few very wealthy people on the perimeters, and then some very poor people who they don't need, you know, a handout. They don't need a hand up, but they need to be left alone and have this weight taken off their shoulders. If you own a row home in Pigtown, where the famous Freddie Gray incident took place, if you're a homeowner in that neighborhood, you're paying $9,000 a year in property taxes. You try that if you don't have a job. That's more in property taxes than people in Montgomery County or Potomac or Prince George's County would pay. Let's go to another place. This is a map that we created of city wage taxes. And as you can see, Philadelphia is almost the king. The combined state and local wage tax is about 7%. We remember the tax burden that that poor family had. You look at another town that was given permission to enact a wage tax because it was full of steel workers and it was full of prosperity, Birmingham, Alabama. Well, Birmingham, Alabama has a tax rate that's about 4%. And there's no income tax to speak of in the rest of Alabama. So what are people going to do if they're in Birmingham and they have a chance? They're going to skedaddle. And I'm not a Texas booster per se, but Texas is doing something right. And if you look at the tax, state and local tax in Houston or any other city in Texas, zero, absolutely. So when I speak to retired homeowners in Philadelphia, and of course I say, "Oh, your kid's going to take over?" No, in Texas. No, they're in Florida. No, they're in Tennessee. People, once they get their education or once they get a skill, they go to where that's going to be paid. Now, you don't get paid as much in Texas, but you keep it all. And people balance that stuff out. One thing that a lot of our bettors believe is that people can't figure this stuff out for themselves. People can figure this stuff out for themselves and do. Now, the last example of competition, Hartford got an effective tax rate of 34.84 mils. To put it in real terms, the effective tax rate, each dot represents the property tax in each Connecticut town or city. And why on earth, that's why I referenced that parking lot in Hartford earlier, why on earth would you spend every year 3.5% of your investment to pay taxes? And that's why people don't go to Hartford. Now, on the other side of the coin, you have a town like Greenwich, and the tax rate is a little over 0.5%, the effective tax rate. There's really no punishment because it's such a wealthy place. But in between, you have what policy thinkers think is a rational tax rate, an effective tax rate of about 2%. In other words, that's fair. Schenectady, New York, the effective tax rate is 8%. That's the highest tax community in New York State. And my buddy lives there. He's working hard. He says, well, I only pay $7,000 dollars a year in taxes. I can make the monthly payment. And I always say, what is that as a percentage of the value of your house? I don't know. So we sat down, and I finally got him to figure out that half the value of his house and land, half his value is paid back to the city every 5 years. There's no rational reason for him to be there, but he can't sell his house. You know, nobody's moving to Schenectady. All the development is subsidized or tax exempt, all of it. Nobody builds a house in Schenectady anymore. Land value tax can be a lot of things. It can be citywide. It can be a district. Pittsburgh's downtown business district is funded by a land value tax, a tax on land only. And they did that consciously. And they did that for a simple reason, that a business district is usually meant to keep the area clean, keep the sidewalks clear, have escorts and guides. And who contributes most to the deterioration of a central business district? The vacant lot owner or the blighted building owner. So they've consciously made a decision in Pittsburgh to make sure that the vacant properties paid their fair share, and that the skyscraper, the one you can see behind you, they've hired maintenance staff, to keep the sidewalk clear and all that. Parking lot owner could care. So that's why they tax the land as a business improvement district. And we were talking about parks a little earlier, and I said that's interesting because one of the best ways to keep a park going, to keep a public asset going, is to tax the people whose value is higher. If you live on Central Park, south, west, east, you've got a built-in advantage, and it's right out your window. And the land values are by definition higher, although I guess on West 57th Street it's starting to block out the sun. The skyscrapers going up there. But Kansas City, at the beginning of the planning profession in the early 1900s, a lot of the planners were land value tax advocates. They came straight from the land value tax movement and philosophy at that time. And the Parks and Boulevard system in Kansas City, Missouri, has two taxes. One is a frontage foot. If you live on the boulevard, you pay. If you have 500 feet, you pay more. If you have 100 feet, you pay less. And the parkway maintenance tax is levied on local land values. It's a separate and discrete land value tax targeted for the specific purpose of keeping up the parks. Now, in the long run, it makes your property more valuable. When you sell, you say, hey, I'm on the Kansas City Parkway system. And so it becomes a symbiotic, mutually beneficial relationship from the public good. Now, if some poor kids come from downtown Kansas City, far away from the parks, they can use it. It's a public asset. But the people paying for it are generally people that live in proximity and benefit from it. It's a real picture of fairness. Regional tax-based sharing is something that in Connecticut we've been talking about in a lot of other places. So I did some research for Berkshire County, the Berkshire County Transit Authority. I think I gave it the wrong name, BERTA, something like that. And they wanted to know, how can we connect? Berkshire County is an interesting place. In the 1820s, 1830s, 40s, 50s, the northern part of the county was wealthy. It had mills. Towns like Pittsfield, North Adams, they built a lot of stuff, not just textiles, but carbon paper, crane printing that makes all of our currency paper. They're all from northern Berkshire County. Water power at the time gave the initial value, the initial push to convince people to come in. Southern Berkshire County was, they considered it kind of hillbilly land. It was farmland. It didn't have water power, it had just flat fields and a valley. Well, after World War II, and especially after 9/11, people escaped from New York and bought land in southern Berkshire County, Great Barrington, Stockbridge, places like that. And so the value and the wealth shifted to where it is, what you can see now. And that's land value per capita. In the southern towns, it's higher. So for land value capture to work here, it has to achieve a purpose. And that purpose is to fund buses to get the now currently poor and out of work people in the northern part of the county to service the people in the southern part of the county who have their money from New York jobs and their pensions. So essentially, we could use a land value tax, land value capture for transit purposes and not drag down the local economy by taxing sales or jobs. So that's another example. Planning is going to be the key to the future, especially in New York City, but all over the country and all over the world. Planning has heretofore been a bunch of good ideas that never happened. Heretofore, planning has been directed by a very few people who stand to benefit. Planning, however, started in the late 1800s and early 1900s, and some of the most beautiful cities in the world were created by planners who were informed on the ideas of land value taxation and Henry George. My technical phrase is mega ultra example of site value, land value, and planning, and that's Canberra, Australia. Canberra, Australia is a beautiful city. It's in the middle of the desert in Australia, and it was designed and built in 20 years. And the main architect, planner, and engineer was Walter Burley Griffin. And Walter Burley Griffin was one of the early planners, and he also was an advocate of land being the only source of public revenue. So this is the Canberra plan, and they got water in, they built a huge infrastructure, and I'm not going to read the quote, but what's interesting is that Burley Griffin in this letter thought that for the capital, Canberra, an annual income from land rentals of 250 to 300,000 pounds a year without taking any property taxes or profits from anywhere else would pay for this city of 25,000. I work with cities of 25,000. In today's dollars, that's the budget that would run a city of 25,000 people. So the actual number that he proposed in 1910 matches the budget today of an American town of 25,000 people. I don't think it's a coincidence. He was very far ahead of his time, and this was built for all people. It was the city beautiful. They were getting away from land tax, but that's their treasurer, and they're eliminating their sales tax and going to straight land tax again. We have a choice, folks. New York City can be what it was for years, which is abandoned factories, or it can be a community that all people can live in, because the land value tax helps planners, increases investment, and incentivizes owner upkeep. It supports smart growth objectives so that we can finally stop losing upper middle class and rich people to the suburbs, bring them back, because we want to make it too expensive for them to go to Rockland or Westchester County. The historic district argument is pretty strong. Planners such as the National Trust for Housing Preservation think that land value tax will keep historic neighborhoods alive. This has been the experience of too many cities. That's a vacant lot in Philadelphia. We want to grow smart. We want to get people to build in that city that you see on the horizon instead of out in the suburbs. Now, the problem with planning, though, is pretty clear. You have external costs that are put on a good plan. And this can be anywhere. It can be in the Bronx, it can be in Manhattan, it can be in Staten. But there are so many external costs that economists call deadweight loss that inhibit people's energy and activity. And one of them is government rules and regulations. You know, getting a building permit in Manhattan is not the easiest thing in the world. It shouldn't be the easiest thing in the world, but there has to be a balance. Then you have the usual suspects in tax abatements. Tax abatements cost all of us money, all of us taxpayers money. And tax abatements and subsidies often go to, as someone pointed out, to say the Trumps, who no longer build but wait for a handout to build. Then planners want us to have green space. We want green space. But land acquisition costs, even in the city, for a public purpose, are very expensive. We pay too much. So you end up with an emptied public purse. A good program can't get off the ground. A good planning project can't get off the ground. So when politics and pennies confront a good plan, the plan may lose. That is a charrette that I worked on, which is kind of a proposal that you give to the citizens in a town called Norristown, Pennsylvania. And Norristown is very, very poor again. The steel mill closed down again. And this was the plan. And it was a terrific plan. It was when it was proposed in 2007, the wrong year to propose anything. But the plan was scotched finally because the subsidy program was withdrawn and the developer said, I can't make it work. I can't make the numbers work. Then he went to the county and the state and they said no. So the only way he could borrow would be on the terms that you and I would borrow if we were to buy a house. So of course he said, I'm not doing that. You know, I'm here to game the system, not to, you know, work around it. So we believe that LVT encourages smart growth. It's Norwalk, Connecticut. That's the main business area, the traditional business area. And this is where all the growth is now taken. It's on the periphery of the town or outside the town. It's everything that's wrong with development. It requires a car to get there. It requires wasting land to provide free parking. And what we want to do is help the Main Street, the old Main Street, which is right near the railroad. It's right near Amtrak, and it's even near I-95. Now again, public investment has transformed Main Street. They have red brick sidewalks. They have Victorian lampposts, and that's beautiful. And they said that's going to bring businesses back. It won't, because Norwalk's taxes are very high compared to the surrounding areas. You see, if you look at the illustration, you can see that that beautiful rehabbed storefront block is empty. The only shop that's there is a thrift shop. And that's a problem. And that's been that way for 10 years. It's close to public transit, it's everything. But the expense of doing business is prohibitive. Yes, did you have a? Because the city and state invested all this money to make it good. But the property taxes are so high that the kind of organic community store or eatery that people want they can't pay the rent that would be required because the buildings are taxed. Also, they zoned the upper floors for apartments, and the asking prices are almost Manhattan rents. They're nice apartments, but people aren't going to pay $3,500 a month to live in Norwalk, Connecticut. All due respect to Norwalk. And you see the same thing on another, yeah, Mike.
Yeah, it just occurred to me, and it's obvious, that without these tax abatements and these tax subsidies, the price of living will go down for the average person, I think. So what's the justification for giving a tax incentive to like the Yankee Stadium so they could build? Who cares? It's going to come back to haunt us by having by giving tax abatements. Things are going to go up. There's going to be higher taxes on the people that are working, so they're not really gaining anything.
They're not. It's people like that are in charge. They like to build what I call edifice complexes. And Yankee Stadium is a great example. How has the Bronx benefited from Yankee Stadium? Yeah, a few popcorn jobs. That's absolutely, the reality. And of course, they made a lot of promises. I remember the Yankees were going to open a playground, a little league compound. That hasn't happened. It's not going to happen.
Don't they say that they benefit from the general influx of people as far as economic stimulation in the area?
There's a few places. There's that bar across the street that has a bad drawing of Thurman Munson and Willie Randolph. But when I go to Yankee games, I'm like everybody else, which is not often. Take the D train, I go in, I see the game, and then I go out.
Right.
Because the community itself is neglected, has been neglected, and there's no plan for the community. If the community were given some freedom to develop in the way it saw fit, people would stay. I'm convinced of it. And when I went to the Yankee games in the 1990s, you didn't feel safe. And I lived in Alphabet City at the time. So, but I think your point is well taken. These large, big-ticket projects, they would build them anyway, I think. But they always ask for a gift first from our top leaders. And the gifts are usually granted because our top leaders don't want people to hate them, and they think.
Also, they'll move out. They'll move out of the city. That's the threat. The Yankee Stadium will go to another state or something like that. So they do it. They give them these subsidies to keep them in New York State.
It has no effect. It has no effect on the economy. These sports stadiums. I mean, if you look at the Meadowlands, what benefit has taken place? Governor Christie built a weird sort of multi-entertainment dining thing that still isn't open. They're rebuilding the whole thing. It doesn't help. And when it comes to the Hudson Yards, the development would have taken place anyway. Guaranteed. It's Manhattan, for Pete's sake. Of course, the construction would happen. So giving away subsidies has become a nice system that works for a very few. I hate to talk about the dominance of a very few, but I think it's a fact of life that we have to acknowledge.